Hello everybody and welcome to another reading wrap-up that I do once every 28 to 31 days, just going over the books I consumed in that time. What a complicated original premise. Although this time we are doing something a little bit different. We're getting into non-fiction reads, as well as well-known fantasy epics, anomalies of terrible, and a fellow YouTuber's book. So it's going to be an exciting month. First, I want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Paired. So full disclosure, Kayla and I had actually heard about and used Paired before this sponsorship. We kind of love little games and things in our relationship. It's a fun, easy to use app for all couples of all ages to develop a deeper connection, with many of the features focusing on building a strong communication for a happy, healthy relationship. Paired Premium has even more to offer. Kayla and I love to do many of their prompts and question packs. They're small, simple, but also meaningful ways we can show up every day in our relationship. They also have quizzes like emotional intelligence or relationship check-ins, as well as games like Would You Rather, always fun, and favorite things. Our most recent was the You or Me game. We did the character traits pack, which we got 60% right. Although I find it hilarious, we both said that we were the more competitive one. Kayla, I am more competitive than you, I win. Paired actually inspired some of our recent dates too. After using the Paired app and talking more in detail about one of the prompts, we ended up signing up for a DIY terrarium class in town. Honestly, it was even more fun than I had expected, and a great keepsake that Mako keeps getting his literal paws in. So whether you're looking to spark a date or just wanting to build a deeper connection with the person you care about most, click my link in the description down below to get 25% off your Paired Premium subscription and deepen your connection with your partner today. Chapter markers, of course, linked down below, but without any further ado, let us go ahead and start off with another Terry Pratchett masterpiece. Masterpiece might be a little bit too strong of a word here because, well, I really did enjoy Equal Rites. I think it is one of the stronger Discworld entries. There's also just like clear elements to the book that are rather unoriginal or predictable, and I feel like I wouldn't be doing my job as a reviewer if I didn't point them out, but I have to just say my enjoyment of this book was top-notch. For those of you who don't know, I've been trying to go back through every single Discworld book and just try and find something special about each one, because I feel like Terry Pratchett most of the time had a very specific reason, message, theme he wanted to cover with each Discworld book he wrote, and Equal Rites is no exception to that. This is clearly a book that has feminist themes throughout it. It also covers many tropes that I feel like Terry Pratchett was just kind of eager to get to and explore either once again or even more within his universe, including like a magical school. And so Equal Rites is just kind of inevitably full of that whimsical, contagious energy that Discworld thrives in. I think this might be my favorite early series example of Discworld magic. This is only the 5th Discworld book in terms of release order, and Equal Rites does delve far further into the mechanisms of the magic systems behind Discworld than most of the other Discworld books, of course, because it's mostly following magic users. But because of the specific situation the protagonist is in and the themes of sexism covered throughout, there's an angle to the exploration of magic within Discworld that is very distinct and unique to Equal Rites. And in my own head, I actually kind of have this scale specifically for Discworld, where I try to judge how much the book goes into the epic fantasy side of Discworld or the more just fairy tale side, where it almost feels like something that could come straight out of Brothers Grimm. Equal Rites for me is much more so into the fairy tale side of things, despite some angles of the story in terms of elements introduced ringing far more true to the epic fantasy tropes. But before we get more into it, I want to just cover the actual setup of the story for the protagonist of Equal Rites, which is maybe in my top 5 Discworld titles as well. Rites. The initiating instance of Equal Rites follow a wizard who is well aware that death approaches. Looking to pass on his staff and power, this wizard seeks out the 8th son of an 8th son. But the child he chooses once it is born is actually a girl, which means there is a young woman, Escarina Smith, who is bestowed with the abilities of a wizard, resulting in Escarina having a unique magical situation and needing to head to the Unseen University, leaving her home of Badass. The village isn't particularly badass, it's just, that's the name. Moving on. Once it becomes clear that Escarina will not be able to control this wizard's magic that is manifesting within her, she is taken off by local witch Granny Weatherwicks on an adventure to reach the proper education for her abilities, and leave it to Terry Pratchett to make that a character's motivation. Gotta love the guy. Now, from that setup alone, you can probably predict quite a bit of Equal Rites, and if there is one major area to criticize with this book on its own, it is a bit predictable, especially once all the characters are put into place like Simon, and you understand where the trajectory of this prodigy wizard is headed, and other certain dark elements are set up to be paid off obviously later in the story. Equal Rites is not going to shock anybody in terms of its narrative, but one needs to look no further than to the actual main character of this book to understand exactly why Equal Rites, despite being a bit predictable, still punches with the top tiers of Discworld overall. I actually do not believe the protagonist, Escarina, is the main character of Equal Rites. She is certainly the protagonist and actually a very interesting and enjoyable character in her own right, but Granny Weatherwax, that's the main character here. Weatherwax is also the vehicle we get so much of the exploration through Discworld's magic in this book with, and she is a great voice to explain all of this with a rather blunt way of stating things that yet provides so much to be read into by the reader and her apprentice in terms of literal implications for magic in the world, but also how things relate to the differences between men and women in this world and their magics. And that's kind of one of Terry Pratchett's strengths as an author. He can tell you a very straightforward story that absolutely utilizes that iceberg of narrative storytelling to make you go like, oh yeah, that's the story. Here's everything that it implies. And all of that formula is how Discworld and Equal Rites as a whole manages to be this grand fantasy space that maintains the reader in that fairy tale vibe. For Equal Rites, I'm feeling a very solid 8 out of 10. I'm a sucker for magic schools, and the characters here are more than enough to make up for a little bit of predictability. And it's just genuinely funny. I found myself laughing so many different times. Bringing down the mood in the room, we have nothing but blackened teeth, which feels like a lie bound in paper. The experience of this book is poorly fleshed out ideas desperately grasping at attempts to be quirky or atmospheric and utterly failing at both. I have genuinely never been more annoyed by prose in my life. This is a very specific criticism, and I want it to be taken as is stated. Nothing but blackened teeth, for me as a reader, accomplished nothing. It had no point. There was zero to be taken away from this. I didn't think I would have to give this criticism for a book put out by a publishing house that supposedly went under substantial edit and review, but you as an author, especially when writing in first person, need to write from the perspective of the character who you are in first person of, and not constantly obnoxiously inject your own observations out of character because you think they're clever. It just doesn't feel like the character's making observations half the time. It just feels like a scene is being explained to me continually. And I can't even say that this loose usage of perspective is utilized to tell a story in a more vivid or visceral way. The atmosphere is cranked all the higher because of it, so it was a good breaking of the rules. No, because Nothing But Blackened Teeth has none of those things. Because every single thing about these characters felt like it was just handed to me on a note card, trying to just tell me who this character was, and all of the atmosphere felt like someone is standing in front of a picture trying to explain to me how a picture should make me feel. I was reading this next to Kayla, and I kept showing her passages, and she agreed with me that, yeah, none of the scene building or the storytelling pulls you in some kind of like narrative line, and instead everything just stops so observations can be made. And the way they're described, real passage from the book, warming up to the thought of small talk, his grin, like a politician's smile beaming up from the cover of GQ, only better because it was actually sincere, larger than life, yet still intrinsically boy next door. Have you...
Daniel, but that could be related to like important character insights, meaning she works for GQ, or there's a political theme, or a model theme. Nope. 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 But it's followed up by this paragraph, tonally so in line.
I thought about corpses. I thought about how many girls were buried beneath us, foreheads together, body fused in a cat's cradle of curled legs and clutching arms. And that is actually a passage I like on its own. If I was going to praise one thing about this book, there are occasionally pretty decent visuals within the narrative. They kind of are just crammed in whenever the author feels like there needs to be a spoopy moment, and far too often interrupted by lines like, "Fine, you guys go do protagonist shit," or descriptors like, "He wasn't much of anything except doughier than ever, not fat, not that there was anything wrong with that, but gluttonous almost, soft as good as clay, beauty in her unfinished pottery, half molded, still slick, the tips of Faze's hair jutting out at the nape, dewed with sweat." What is this story? That's a good place for us to go next. Nothing But Blackened Teeth tells the story of a group of people who claim to be friends but do never act like it. They are all just gargantuan assholes that go into a haunted house as people are preparing to get married. And NBBT tries so hard to make you care so much about these characters' relationship troubles, it becomes genuinely flabbergasting how little is actually there in terms of what you're actually supposed to be caring about. Like, the author has set themselves up to be like, okay, this is a drama-focused horror story where character conflict is what's going to motivate the plot. Great, but you're never even given a reason to care about any of it. Like, you just watch these people bicker at each other like it's a horrible episode of an already bad reality TV show, and then a lot of them die, which in its own way could be like, oh, okay, I get to watch miserable people die in creative, interesting ways. Neat. Except no one is killed in a way I find remarkable in the least if you are even mildly experienced with horror. Because once the big horror element is introduced, which I will not get into for spoiler reasons, it is probably the most mishandled understanding of what makes a reading experience scary I have ever understood, backdropped by some of the clunkiest character development and revelations I've ever experienced in any medium, polished off by attempts at witty, clever humor that are just exactly the quality you would expect with everything else I've set up into this point. Nothing But Blackened Teeth is a sharp and devastating exploration of grief, the parasitic nature of relationships, and the consequences of our actions. No, it is not. It is Walmart A24 in novella form. All right, let's move on to another type of book that I have far more positive feelings on, but also it's going to be a little bit harder to recommend because I know a lot of people are not necessarily into anthologies, and some people are not into comics. But this is a wondrous comic anthology. No, I don't think you're going to get super emotionally invested in the various stories. I don't think the art is even on some like explosive berserker next level, oh my god. Not even any individual story from volume 1 of Flight really jumps out to me as like a masterpiece, but overall, it's just wildly enjoyable, and seeing a bunch of different authors, artists come together to put stories out that all revolve around themes of flight was executed just remarkably well. My personal favorite entry was Paper Strings by Jen Wong, which I feel like in a incredibly short number of pages dissected and presented the specialness of shared experience, of friendship potentials never met, all presented in an art style that in a series of comics that really shared no cohesive style to them still managed to stand out as exceptional. And yes, other stories like Air and Water were a bit more imaginative. Still, I'm going to remember and think on Paper Strings for a while, and why that one just actually got an emotional reaction out of me. So if you're in the mood for just having a anthology nearby where every time you have a moment you can just bang out another short story, I really recommend Flight. I'm not going to spend too much more time on it because it is just nice reading, but my anthology crowd, you should know what's up. This one's a banger. Next up, I am continuing my journey through Monster, which to me personally is hitting like if you took a great David Fincher thriller and smashed it together with a fictional soap opera. Like, specifically a fictional one, because the events within Monster are so over the top, I don't even think a soap opera would go there. For those of you wondering, I am reading the perfect edition of Monster, so I just did volume 2, which covers in the original published editions volumes 3 and 4, up to chapter 32 or 34, I believe. And I am having so much fun. Someone put it perfectly in my last video where I covered Monster, where essentially this is ridiculous storytelling with things introduced that feel so corny or cliche, but taking place around characters who feel quite real and are motivated so clearly that you end up aligning with them because their morals are fairly straightforward to understand. But getting into vague, very vague spoilers, I want to just cover some of the plot points that were brought up in the Perfect Edition 2 without any context whatsoever, just so I can really establish how wild a ride this narrative is getting. People aging from being so afraid, reasonable. A surgery conducted at gunpoint, but the gun isn't being pointed by a criminal, a cop trying to make an arrest on the surgeon. But the person being operated on is their mother, so they can't stop the surgery now, can they? That's number 2 on the list. A wealthy woman scorned, deciding because her gardener is actually possibly getting back with the mother of his child, she should burn her entire mansion down and devote her life to ruining the life of someone else who is entirely unrelated to everything else I just said. A child walking into a bar, getting served a drink, slamming it, walking outside, vomiting it up. Why? Fascists trying to make better Hitler. Not bring Hitler back to life, I want to make that clear, but possibly making better Hitler. This video just got demonetized. But this is the beauty of Monster, sorry. I still feel the stakes. Like, it's able to go to these just absurd, wild places and show you things that feel like they just don't belong in a story that is not trying to be sci-fi or fantasy. Yet, I'm still at the end of the day, like, really feeling for Dr. Tenma, and I want him to succeed and be okay. And the people who have screwed him over, I do not like. And those that I'm not sure where they're gonna fall on yet in the moral spectrum grand arc of the story and their own development, I am curious to see. Like, it has totally maintained my focus while simultaneously having me watch 2 people have a conversation through a sink drain that is perfectly heard and understood. It's still too early to give a review, but if you're curious to pick up a non-fantasy, non-sci-fi thriller manga, so far, yeah, I recommend Monster. And next up, we have Vagabond, or as Kayla and I have been calling it to each other, Vagabond. Now, despite Vagabond being recommended to me for so long, I've actually managed to keep the narrative and the characters, even themes, just totally out of my knowledge. And I quite like the beginning of it, possibly because of that. Now, I've only read the first 10 chapters, I believe, volume 1, so bear with me if I'm getting anything that's clarified later on in the story wrong, but it seems we are following 2 friends who have awoken on a battlefield after the battle is over, having survived, then trying to find a nearby village, medicine, something to get them back into survivable shape for even just getting home. After a run-in with some soldiers who are looking to just kill refugees from the battlefield, they do find some women living in the forest and are nursed back to health there. They have a run-in with a local gang of ruffians who they end up actually successfully just massacring, and one of the 2 decides to stay with the women in the village while the other goes off home to tell the family and everything like, hey, your son's alive, he's just staying with a random woman in the woods. And I won't spoil anything more from there, though I did just get to, I'll say, the standoff after the bath. And already I understand why Vagabond seems to have a fairly large overlap in terms of audience with Berserk, though the series clearly have a different initiating standpoint on the view of their main characters and violence, where Guts is a victim of violence who is essentially raised by it. These 2 are children playing at blood. That's actually very much so stated within the text. They are those who are not seeming so far yet to be hyper traumatized to what they have experienced in the story. I predict that is yet to come, and they seem to have actually a mentality of people that I believe if Guts came across them, he would kill them. Especially the main protagonist, whose name I believe is pronounced Musashi Miyamoto. I actually think I didn't do terribly there despite my dyslexia. Explicitly states he wants to go off and be the best swordsman, the greatest fighter. That usually brings a path of blood, and something that I don't think is a morally just motivation for someone. I want to go out and learn to be the best killer. In my little bit of research I did after reading the first volume, I understand Vagabond is very loosely based off of real historical figures, but is without question still a work of fiction. So I'm really interested to see what moral standpoint the narrative is going to take with a character who seems to be based off someone real that is a historic figure within Japan, but its motivations seem to be a trajectory path of blood. This is already pretty dark and disturbing as well. There are threats of the R word, there is severe gore, but it's not nearly as stylized as what you get in Berserk. Like someone gets their arm cut off in Vagabond, and instead of a gargantuan spray of blood, you instead just see like, okay, there's the bone, the meat, the tissue, and I like that. It's like a different approach to gore that feels just as visceral as Berserk, but less artistically extreme. I'd say what I'm most excited for at this point, though, is the main protagonist, what their evolution as a character is going to be. I'm not super connected to any of the side characters at this point, and I don't even think the story necessarily wants me to be. I'm being set up to really question this protagonist as someone I like or dislike, because already I've seen themselves put themselves in situations for their own gain, cause danger, risk for innocent people, though this seems to be a pretty bleak view of your average person in terms of the world for a story, so I don't know if I'll be really necessarily feeling bad for the people caught in this driven man's wake. But for just the first volume, getting me that interested in a protagonist, I definitely am going to be continuing to read Vagabond. And some of you are probably wondering why One Punch Man is not continued forward here in this month's review. But that's just because I wasn't as hooked, and I'd rather get through things like Monster and try out Vagabond before I go back to finish One Punch Man. Stay tuned, it will get covered eventually. I just have other priorities right now. That brings us, though, to Blood for Coins by fellow YouTuber and booktuber Cam Wolf. He sent me the audiobook and an ebook for review here because I'm buds with the guy, at least as buddy as content creators can be. Right, Cam? We're bud. And I decided to give it a read/listen, and I have some mixed feelings here. This is a rather short entry from Cam. I got through it in about a day. I switched between reading the book and the narration. The narration, solid as hell. Really like the voice actor. And maybe I am projecting a bit here, but it seems that Cam and I share a lot of similar strengths and weaknesses when it comes to our efforts in our current states as authors. I first want to say, in terms of tone and concept, Blood for Coins hits a bit different. I really like this Western buddy drama, like gory, simplified fantasy world that Cam has managed to craft in a rather short amount of time. It's nothing mind-blowing, but it definitely has its own vibe. And while I struggled more with the first 2/3 of the book, I'd say the last third are really where Cam's strengths as an author are managing to come to the forefront. For those of you interested in what the story is actually about, the synopsis reads, "For the right price, Enzo and Rascal will handle any problem you have, putting down monsters, transporting dangerous cargo, acquiring valuables. They'll do it all. The only problem? One of them is locked away in the world's most notorious prison. It's time for a jailbreak." My big problems, unfortunately, for Blood for Coins come in 3 parts: pacing, structure, and especially editing. I'm not entirely sure what the editing process was for Blood for Coins, but it definitely wasn't enough. I wasn't just finding the prose to be a bit clunky, I was finding straight up errors. And a book can be so action-packed and personality-filled, but if I'm being jarred as a reader because it feels like scenes are happening too quickly or drawn out unnecessarily, there is no flow to the reading experience. Add in the actual just jarring nature of not having a book being edited up to par, even for self-publish, and it ends up really dragging down the reading experience as a whole. I'm happy to say, though, there is potential here. Not only is the world itself imaginative and the characters distinct, they certainly feel like they also belong with this world, and Cam strikes me with the specific things he is focusing on and clearly putting in a bit more effort in the writing as someone who is really ambitious as to where he plans on taking this series or world, and so I do find myself, just as a fantasy fan, drawn in by that aspect. And it was just a fun time overall as well, especially if more technical issues don't bother you that much as a reader. I'm feeling a pretty solid 5. And finally, we have something that I know is extremely out of my wheelhouse to talk about and review, but it's a book I consumed as a part of my own mental health journey and has made a significant impact on me. And so if I can share it with some people who are interested, I think it's worth talking about. The Body Keeps the Score. It is a psychology book. It is a book about not only the history of psychology, but the current cutting edge, at least when this book was released, updates on what we are learning about trauma and how much it affects people, not only in the extreme PTSD end of the spectrum, but a more just close to home, day-to-day life, getting through this world, traumatized individual. This book thoroughly breaks down our history of failings within psychology and how much better we are doing now, and just how much more still really needs to get done. Because while I think The Body Keeps the Score does have some really optimistic messages in it about just how much more nuance and understanding we really have of the human mind and how it develops, there are still so many factors at play within our political world as well that are holding up actual progressive advancement into the treatment of the individual on a psychological level. And of course, gross, disgusting profit motives. It is not a guidebook on how to get better, but for someone like me who is struggling with repressed memories, trauma, anger management, it does a wonderful job putting into words so many things I knew deep down, but lacked the information to express. If you're also struggling with mental health, this book can get you a better grasp on being okay with your feelings and experiences through dispelling so many of the mental health oversimplifications, myths, and stigmas that are still held today and reinforced by things like Hollywood movies or shows. The Body Keeps the Score also does dive into the issue of just trying to medicate away deeper problems without ever saying you should go off your meds. My God, if you're on meds and they're working for you, stay on them, please. This book, along with regular therapy, journaling, taking better physical care of myself, and soon starting group therapy, has resulted in me feeling overall far more tethered to my life. And it does all of this without feeling like it is trying to just preach an agenda, despite that obviously being what the author is doing. It's just that they have so much evidence, so much experience, so many observations backed up by things a lot of us deep down know, that you end up not feeling like you're being preached to. You feel like someone is taking something that you've believed, but just hasn't actually been really accepted by a wider narrative, and being like, here are the dozens of studies we've done to show that, yeah, just giving a whole bunch of kids antidepressants maybe not the best way to address systemic poverty within this country and the higher rates of abuse those kids are then opened up to. It's actually really simple what The Body Keeps the Score is, and it's the fact that the book doesn't try and reach beyond that lends so much credibility to what it's trying to preach. It is just an expert in their field who has spent their life on a topic, trauma, giving you the latest and greatest research from their career that seems to be, from what I can find online, respected and had impact on the actual field of psychology today. So yeah, I think it's really important for us as individuals in a society that is coming to really fully understand what trauma is, especially if you have been through it, to look into how your mind is probably reacting, growing, or not as a result of the things you've been through. That can only really yield beneficial results and help you in your mental health arsenal to fight back better. And that's all this book is, and that's why I recommend it. It is funny, though, that a book that is such an unhappy read can validate so many things I hold within myself and make me be like, oh, I feel better today because I found out I'm not alone in feeling this terrible isolation based off things I experienced at such a young age I can't even clearly remember them. Oh my God. It feels very wrong to put a numbered rating on a book like that, so I'm just going to say it gets my recommendation for those who are also interested in learning more about mental health and the current history of how the psychological field has gotten to where it is. But that is just every book I read in the last 28 to 31 days. If you'd like to check them on out, I'll have each one linked down below. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace.